Good morning, everybody. Um, this week we're going to be talking about Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis, and a little bit of the trial as well, just because they kind of go hand in hand. And I've been really trying to think of a good way to dig into this because Kafka is like a really, I think he tends to be a somewhat misunderstood person, misunderstood writer. And just because everybody seems to think that he's this like, highbrow intellectual type of, thing to read. And he's really, well, I mean, he is because you can really dig into it, but really he's not. I mean, let's start with the Metamorphosis. In the Metamorphosis, you have a character, Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one morning to find that he's turned into a giant dung beetle. And his very first worry is not, oh my God, I'm a giant insect. It's actually, oh my God, I got to get dressed and go to work because I'm the only person that brings in money for my parents and my sister. And so, in all honesty, for about at least the first half of that story, it kind of reads as almost a dark comedy. It starts to get a little bit more serious in its second half, but I mean, it's still more or less a dark comedy because it's really just about Gregor trying to say, hey, look, I'm still Gregor. Yeah, I'm a giant dung beetle now, but I mean, I really want to help everybody, and everybody misunderstanding him. Um, and I mean, and to be honest with you, if you read it in the right sort of like environment, it's actually a pretty cool like dark comedy. So, in all honesty, Franz Kafka is not the depressing, horrible, intellectual writer that we've all been led to think. Let's take a look at the trial. The trial concerns the character Joseph K. Yes, Franz Joseph Kafka. Basically, this person wakes up in the morning. He's told by authorities he's been charged with a crime. They won't tell him what crime he's been charged with, and they won't tell him when the trial will be. They won't tell him what his defenses are. And after a while, he's told that he was found guilty and that his punishment will be forthcoming. In all honesty, basically, a metaphor for life. We get born, we know we're going to get a judgment and that we're going to die someday. We just don't know when and we don't know how. Both of these are almost like dark comedies about life. And it's kind of important to know who Kafka was before we get into talking too much about him. Because Kafka really kind of wrote from his own life a lot. When Kafka was born, he was born to a father that really wanted what the late what you know a late 1800s father would call a manly man. He wanted a guy that was like really sporty, all that kind of stuff. And Franz Kafka was not very sporty. He was not very manly. He was a very frail, very sick child who spent almost all his time in his room. And his father made no bones about the fact that Franz was a complete disappointment to him. And so after he grew up, he went in. He had a job that, let's face it, he probably didn't totally understand because nobody he wasn't high enough to understand what was going on, and he wasn't low enough to be able to work without worrying about what was going on. So basically, these two things, so those two things, led to the metamorphosis on one hand and the trial on the other. But I also want to talk about what it means to be Kafkaesque. People use that word a lot, and I really think I just want to discuss it because I really think it kind of overlaps with another author that was writing at the same time as Kafka. But let's talk about what it means to be Kafkaesque first. Kafka wrote about things that are not human. They're just like these processes that are neither good nor bad in and of themselves because they don't have any morality to appeal to. And as they work, they affect humans' lives. And that's really what it was. Something made Gregor become a giant dung beetle. there's this unknown judicial system that's trampling on Joseph K. in the trial, and I think that's kind of interesting because, and it's hard to put a finger on it but I I really don't want to like belabor the point because I think this other author needs their own video. But HP Lovecraft was writing at the same time, and a lot of what HP Lovecraft wrote about was these huge, impersonal, inhuman beings that were neither moral nor immoral, whose actions affected the people in his stories. I just find it very interesting that these two writers, who never had any interaction with one another, who probably didn't read one another because Kafka was not published until after his death, and Lovecraft, for all the popularity that he had, his popularity during his lifetime was really limited to the U.S. So it just seems to me that there was something in the air, and since they both stopped writing somewhere around the 1920s, I would argue that what they were sensing, what they were both trying to give voice to, was a feeling of dehumanization due to capitalism. Capitalism had started to take over, at least in the U.S., right around that time. Ford was creating its assembly line, which was turning workers into just cogs in a machine that could be replaced by any other worker. And human beings were starting to interact with something that we had created, this monetary system called capitalism, that had started to take on a life of its own. It no longer mattered whether Henry Ford or anybody else at the very top was moral or immoral. The capitalist corporations were going to continue doing as they wanted to because the corporation had become almost separate from the people in charge of it. And I think that was kind of scary to a lot of people at the time because, let's face it, it was almost like a Frankenstein's monster that was arising to gobble up a lot of the power that human beings used to have. Before the industrial age and capitalism took hold, we were still sort of in a sort of like late stage feudal time. And I'm not really saying it's not really exactly that, because the era of the kings and feudal lords had long since passed. But we were still sort of in between that and what we would become. And as for all the bad stuff about feudal monarchies were dependent upon the person at the top. They were dependent on whether the king was a good person or a bad person. The funny thing about corporations is corporations don't really respond directly to whether the person at the top is immoral or moral. They're going to go for the most money that they possibly can at any one time. And that's got to be considered almost like a Lovecraftian elder god, or like the unseen judicial system. Try saying the word judicial. You sound like you're drunk every time. But anyway, the unknown judicial system of Franz Kafka. It's something that you can't see, that you can't directly interact with, that's not human, but still grinding people underneath it. And I'm not even against capitalism. I'm just saying, anything like that is going to feel that way when it first arises, especially when it first creates a completely inhuman and unknown thing. And it's not the first time human beings ever had to interact with something that didn't care about our morals, because you can stand in front of a tornado and shake your fist at it and say, you're doing something wrong. And believe it or not, the tornado isn't going to particularly care about your system of morals. It's still going to continue doing it. Capitalism had become sort of like that, especially in that run up to the Gilded Age. And that was and that was a problem that I think that both Kafka and Lovecraft kind of saw coming, and were trying to write about in their stories. I think that both of them had a little bit of a prescience on that. Kafka obviously was writing much more from a sort of like fictionalized autobiography, and I have a feeling that Lovecraft was writing. Well, we'll talk more about that when we talk about Lovecraft. We'll just say Lovecraft was writing from a very personally racist point of view, but his work was important. So we'll talk about it some other time. But both of these were writing about something that was bigger than humans, didn't care about our morals, and just simply wanted to exist. Anyway, that's a concept that I had, and I just wanted to get it out there. Let's go back to Franz Kafka specifically, because honestly, I think everybody should read Franz Kafka, at least the Metamorphosis and the Trial, just because I think a lot of time we're given the wrong idea of Kafka in popular culture. We're given this idea that he's this like serious, horribly depressing person, writer, and he really, I mean, I'm sure Kafka himself was kind of depressed because he grew up feeling he had failed his father, and he actually worked in a job where he had no idea what was going on. So, those two things alone probably depressed him a little bit. But his stories, honestly, if you read them in a specific way, they're, like I said, they're almost dark comedies. And you can almost laugh out loud at some of the reactions of the characters in it. I mean, Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis, worrying more about getting to the train so he wasn't late to work, rather than the fact that he was a giant insect. Let's face it, that's kind of funny. I would definitely suggest reading, a little bit of Kafka. His stories aren't that long. You can probably pick up a collection of his stories, and anyone's like the Metamorphosis is like I think 40 pages long. Same thing for the Trial, and you just give it a read. You might like it, you might not like it, but give it a just know what you're talking about when you say something is Kafkaesque. Anyway, that's my thoughts for today. Have a great day. Bye bye.